Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. My name is Stephen Resch, and I'll be moderating our second session, which is called Explaining the Identified Victim's Bias. We have a great panel. And the format here is I will give a brief introduction to our panelists, and then they'll each give their talks. And then after all four talks, we'll have 30 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So there's also a slight change from your program. We think we have a little better order for giving the talks. So Amitabh Chandra is going to speak first, and then the rest of the speakers will follow in the way they show in the program. So Dr. Chandra is a professor of public policy at the Kennedy School, and he's an economist and a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on the productivity and cost growth in healthcare and racial disparities in healthcare. And he has many honors, including the Kenneth Arrow Award for the best paper in health economics and the Eugene Garfield Award for impact on medical research. So without further ado.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm here to tell you a story. As you can see, this is a talk about stories and statistics. And this morning you heard a number of examples of people being drawn to stories, people being drawn to identified lives, and sort of a theme that maybe we should be thinking a little harder about statistical lives. I'm going to tell you an example that goes the other way, where we started thinking about the identified lives, and somehow the economists, the bean counters, the cost effectiveness analysis people were actually able to win the argument for a change. So it's just a story, but it's a story about statistics. And so to start this off, let me take you back to United Airlines 232. So this is a flight that you probably remember. This was a flight from Denver, Colorado to O'Hare on July the 19th, 1989. It was a DC-10. And what happened to this DC-10 was basically the fan blades in the engine above the tail came apart, and they were sucked into the engine. When they were sucked into the engine, the blades essentially destroyed all the hydraulic lines on the plane, and so the pilots lost complete control. And so they did this crash landing in Sioux Falls, and it was very, very sort of fiery, and they had absolutely no ability to land the plane well. But if you look at kind of what happened, there were 296 people on board, 185 survived, 111 died, and one of the people who died, unfortunately, was an infant. And I want to tell you the story of that one infant and what happened as a result of that one infant death. So this happens, and immediately what you see, or soon after what you see, is the American Academy of Pediatrics puts out a press release saying that we have to put an end to lap travel for children on airplanes, because as you know, children under 2 can ride on a parent's lap with no ticket. So the one infant who died was one of those under 2-year-old infants. And so what the AAP said was, this is terrible what happened to that one child, and what we need to do is make sure that we put an end to lap travel for infants and force the families to buy an additional seat in which you can strap the car seat in or whatever, and then things will be better. So that's what happens, and you can read the article published in Pediatrics in 2001. Now let me work you through what happens as a result of this AAP position. So the background is, if you're under 2, you can ride on parent's lap. Then there's this crash. The NTSB, in examining the crash, agrees with the pediatricians and says that we may want universal restraint. So not just restraints for kids over the age of 2, but for all kids. And at that point, the NTSB, it urges the FAA, which is ultimately the only agency that can require this, to consider this infant restraint. And this really reached a head in 1994 because another lap child, another child who was not in one of these car seats strapped in, died in a crash. So what happens? The FAA does a study, and what they get really good data on the survivability of previous crashes. And they find that if we move to a system with infant restraint, this is what the pediatricians wanted, we would save 5 infant deaths over 10 years. Now, you can do the cost effectiveness analysis on that particular decision. So what the FAA is saying is, if you think that this is smart public policy, if you think it's actually smart to require parents to buy this car seat and an extra ticket. And the extra ticket cost $200 a ticket. This is back in the early 90s. That's why it's $200 a ticket. The implied value of life is $1.3 billion. That's much higher than even the biggest values of life numbers that economists who shill for the drug companies use. That per life year translates into about $43 million. Now, David Cutler this morning would say, if you're trying to do cost effectiveness analysis, there's some disagreement, but people use numbers like 100,000, maybe $130,000 per life year. If I was working for a company like Genentech and I was in love with every shiny new medical technology, I might say, gosh, I don't want to use 130,000, I want to use 300,000. But no one's using 43 million per life year. But that is the implied value of life if we were to mandate this policy, because it would only save 5 infant deaths over 10 years. Okay, so that's what happens as a result of the FAA study. What's the next step? The next step is Washington and congressional hearings. And so here's Congressman Guerin asking the NTSB director, if we were to give you $100 million, these are actual quotes, and you were entrusted with saving lives, where would you apply it top priority? Basically, he's asking the guy, you run the NTSB, you could do lots of things with the $100 million, you could equip planes with all kinds of things, where would you want to spend your money? And here's his response. So this is a direct quote from Barry Sweedler, who is the director of the NTSB. And he says, there's a long list of safety issues that need addressing. And I think it's probably best for us to try to lay out what the issues are and try not to prioritize which safety issue is more important than other safety issues. Coming to Washington, and then he starts a story, which is really compelling. He says, coming to Washington, we ran into some turbulence around some thunderstorms, and there were some other lab children that the mothers were having trouble restraining. Many of them were crying and screaming. The little kid in the safety seat slept throughout the whole thing. Okay, so this is what the director of the NTSB told Congress. He basically gave Congress a story about the virtues of kind of having parents buy this additional seat. And so his view at the end of it was, so I think that there is more than enough evidence that substantiates what we're trying to do. And this is all you can go to the Federal Register, this is all in the transcript. Now, how do you combat this kind of world? This is the identified victim world in some sense. You've got a really powerful story grounded in absolutely no data, drawn from the flight that this guy took to Washington, about how there was turbulence, and basically, the kid slept through the turbulence fine in his own seat. And so that's basically the more than enough evidence we need to do smart public policy. What do you do at that point when you already have an FAA report saying that the implied value of life from these sorts of mandates would be in the domain of about $43 million per life year? What do you do? Well, what the FAA did was they called in economists and cost effectiveness analysis people. And so here's what those guys were able to do. The FAA report said that while it is true that the infant restraint would prevent a maximum of 5 infant deaths over 10 years, that is true, they agreed with that, they turned this entire debate around on its head. They said, people will now stop flying and start driving. And as a result, there will be a net increase of 82 deaths over 10 years because some parents will not be able to afford the more expensive seat, and they will now drive to wherever they were going in the first place. And so now you've made it about 10 deaths or 5 deaths over 10 years versus 82 deaths over 10 years. So now you've sort of leveled the playing field. It's still about this bias, but you've sort of made this you've sort of pitched one kind of bias against itself. And of course, the reason for the 82 death number is completely unsurprising. The blue line is the number of people getting on a plane. This is an enplanement over time. And you can see that over this time period from 1980 to about 2002, and 2002, just after 9/11, it's plateaued off at about 37,000 people are getting on planes in the United States. And if you look at the number of passenger car and light truck occupant fatalities over the same time period, you can see, that number is the light blue line. That light blue line is about 37,000 deaths per year in traffic fatalities. If you're looking at how many people actually get on a plane, it's close to 500 or 600 million enplanements per year. And we know that, like, if you just take the blue line very seriously and say how many airplane crashes would get us up to something like 33,000 vehicular fatalities a year, do the math. So a typical Airbus A320 carries about 200 passengers. So if you took the 32,000 deaths and divided by 200, that would be 160 planes. About one a day would have to fall out of the sky. So our vehicular fatality rate is sort of the statistical equivalent of one plane falling out of the sky every day, and that gets very little attention. Now, but that's a very academic way to make the point, and I think the point of my talk is to say the academic way of making the point that 33,000 vehicular fatalities a year is the equivalent of one Airbus 320 falling out of the sky. That doesn't resonate with policymakers. A much better way to make the point is to say, okay, you want people to buy an extra plane ticket. That's great. You'll save 5 lives over 10 years, but some people will be forced to drive. We know what the price responsiveness to higher prices on airplanes is, and the counterfactual number of deaths that will occur because of those dangerous roads is 82. Well, what happened as a result of this? So here's Congressman Jim Lightfoot when he saw the FAA report. He said, the question, I think, comes down to how many more children must die, how many more have to be hurt before we reach the threshold of the FAA's ghoulish cost-benefit ratio. So this was the response to actually kind of coming up with that 80-something lives number. And here's our good friend Ralph Nader. Nobody says it as well as Ralph says it. The argument in support of the FAA's resistance to the NTSB is unreasonable on its face and ridiculous in its justification. It protects theoretical children driving in cars at the expense of real flesh and blood infants whose safety is unquestionably compromised when flown as a lap baby. So I think they're sort of, the 2 days that we're spending wrapped up in a quote from Mr. Nader. I have to say, this is the one example where cost-effectiveness analysis carried the day. Because at the end of the day, economics and statistics triumphed. And it is not the case that everybody with an infant is required to buy a seat for their child. And I think in part, it was because of the genius of the people who did that counterfactual calculation. It's always made me kind of wrestle with the fact that at the end of the day, policymakers like me who kind of say, gee, maybe we're spending a little too much on healthcare, how might we reduce it? At the end of the day, the academic argument is not going to carry the day. At the end of the day, there's something about the story that carries the day, and this is probably because the story is far more interesting and much more understandable than the numbers. I think that there's an emotional connection to the passionate storyteller. In this case, there was an emotional connection to the heroic, dedicated flight attendants and pediatricians, and congressmen who were sort of pitched against unfeeling economists. So I think that actually drives the connection to stories. As I began to think about this, I think that there's something about involuntary risks being perceived as being far worse than voluntary risks. And by that I mean that the risk of dying as this infant is viewed as being involuntary to the infant and the passengers, but somehow the act of driving from Boston to New Haven is viewed as a voluntary risk that parents subjugated their kids to. So that's sort of the third reason. The fourth reason is what we're talking about today, but I want to break down this bias between the identifiable victim bias into sort of 3 components. The first is this idea of the availability heuristic. And I'm not a psychologist, but I've been really drawn to this idea of the availability heuristic as an explanation for why people are drawn to identified lives. The availability heuristic is just a mental shortcut. And it's a mental shortcut that uses the ease with which examples come to mind to make judgments about the probability of events. So because I can imagine a plane crash like this, I think a plane crash is actually very likely. So that's the availability heuristic at work. And I think there's something about stories. Because they're stories and colorful, they allow the listener to invoke the availability heuristic a lot faster than the numerical calculation. Cure, as a result, is always valued a lot more than prevention. And I think one consequence of this that health economists like me struggle with is that preventing rare disease is valued a lot more than treating common disease. And I think there's something here about equity as well, that infants deserve the same level of protection. So I'm going to wrap up and basically tell you that at the end of the day, when I teach public policy to my students, I leave them with these two quotes. This comes from John Adams and Michael Thompson's work. Rather than understanding policymakers as problem solvers who apply objective, scientific, and value-free methods to cure society's ills, we should think of them as performers who seek to persuade an audience. And I think the best policy arguments are not the policy arguments that people like me are used to putting forth, but they're actually policy arguments that tell a story. In some sense, we have to sort of perhaps use the story to provide a setting, to point to the heroes, to point to the villains in the story, follow a plot, and suggest a solution. And it's a lot more work to kind of do public policy this way, where you use the statistics, but you use the statistics only to devise to select who the heroes and villains are. But there is something very, very, I think, very deep in the human psychology, because you see this all over the place. I mean, Stephen Gold had made this point that I have up for you over here, and so do psychologists who say that humans are primates whose cognitive capacity shuts down in the absence of a story. So that's certainly the view from an economist who has to wrestle every day with physicians, with patients saying, gee, you're a death panelist, and because you're using this cost-effectiveness criteria, but I have this compelling story of a patient who was treated with this drug, which failed the clinical trials that you talked about, but then walked out of the ICU completely alive and well. I have found that rather than dealing with them on the numbers, to take the numbers and write a story around the numbers. Thank you.
All right. So our next speaker will be Deborah Small. She's an associate professor of marketing and psychology and holds an appointment in the psychology department at Penn as well, marketing and psychology at Wharton, and the other appointment at Penn. She has conducted research with George Lowenstein at Carnegie Mellon that sought to understand the psychological processes driving the identified victim's bias, and I'm sure she's going to enlighten us today. Thanks. It does, yeah. That's the laser
part. Hi. It's a real pleasure to be here. The topic of identifiable victims and statistical victims was actually the subject of my dissertation, which I completed now 8 years ago. So it's nice to see that there's so much interest in this topic today as well. It was also a real honor to get to meet Tom Schelling for the first time this morning, and I have a quote for him just to kick off. So I think this quote nicely gets at a lot of the psychology that we discuss in our work. So Schelling said, "The death of a particular person involves anxiety and sentiment, guilt and awe, responsibility and religion. But most of this awesomeness disappears when we deal with statistical death." Now, despite the fact that this topic had been discussed since Schelling's seminal article in '68, there was actually very little empirical research before I started working on this, and now there's a lot by many other people as well. And I think part of the reason why it hadn't been studied, and one of the real difficulties we ran into in trying to study it, is that it's hard to say what the effect actually is, and I think we've already seen that a little bit in some of the discussion so far, where people are using it in different ways. And part of the reason it's hard to empirically study the identifiable victim effect is that typically, in all these anecdotes we've heard, identifiable victims are always confounded by lots of information, right? So be it a story or a picture. You can see here, this is one of my favorite ads from UNICEF. As a side note, charities understand very well the identifiable victim effect. They understand the power it has to get people to open up their wallets. But I like this picture. This girl is very pretty, and it's sort of interesting the way her face is cut off in half. She has, I don't know if you can see it, but this tear, it's all black and white, but except for the tear, which is blue. Right? And so imagine this ad works, meaning that it raises more money for UNICEF than, say, another ad which features statistics of kids like this girl. Well, can we really say that that's because she's an identifiable victim? It could be, or it could be many things. Maybe it's the picture. Maybe it's, something about her being a female. Maybe it's simply a blue tear effect. We have all these things, all this information about her, which is naturally confounded with her status as an identifiable victim. And so originally in our work, we sought to kind of strip away this information and try to get at the root of what identifiability actually is. So I'm going to briefly talk about 3 different sets of findings, and because of the short amount of time of this presentation, I'm just going to give snippets of research from each. And each of these goes a lot deeper than what I'm going to present today, so I'm more than happy to discuss further offline or share papers with people if anyone's interested in any of the particulars. But so 3 different things I want to touch on. So the first is that an identifiable victim has been determined, right? Whereas statistical victims have yet to be determined. It turns out that, and think of most of the examples that have been discussed so far this morning, typically we're talking about one victim, right? Although we sometimes say identifiable lives, the most compelling examples are generally about one person as opposed to many. And so that's another important factor. And the third one deals with emotion, and we've heard about this already in some of these anecdotes. So identifiable victims tend to be very, we'll call it affect-rich. They're emotionally compelling, whereas statistics tend to be drier, more pallid. They don't evoke emotion. Okay, so let me begin with identifiable victims have been determined. I should have mentioned earlier that most of the research I'm going to be presenting today is experimental. I'm primarily an experimental psychologist. So let me walk you through the methods of how we examined this notion of determinateness. So there's this paradigm, this experimental paradigm used frequently in experimental economics and more in psychology called the dictator game. It's basically an anonymous allocation task. And this study is derived from that, so I'll give you the breakdown of how it works. So we bring people into the lab. In this study, we brought it 10 at a time. And each participant was given $10. We do this with real money. And they were privately assigned a unique number between 1 and 10. Then we, based on random assignment, we put them into 2 groups. And the first group got to keep their money. We'll call them the keeps. They didn't hear these terms, but we'll call it that for this presentation. The other group had to forfeit their money back to the experimenter. This is how we made victims in the laboratory setting. So now we have 5 people who have money, fortunate people, and the other 5 have lost their money. And we pair them up, and all these pairings happen anonymously, so nobody ever knows who they're paired with. All the decisions that they make are kept confidential, and the participants are made aware of all of this, right? So it's all privately handled. And within these pairings, each fortunate participant, so someone who got to keep their money, has a choice. They can give any of that amount of money to the person with whom they're paired, who has nothing, or they can keep it all from themselves, right? And the reason this study has been used to sort of test the self-interest assumption from economics, because according to rational self-interest, of course, all the fortunate participants should keep all of their money. They have no incentive to share. But in fact, in these games, many people do give away as much as half, typically. So we did the pairing, so everybody was paired up with someone else, and then we randomly assigned them to one of 2 experimental treatment conditions: the undetermined condition, which is like statistical victims, and the determined condition, which is going to be like an identifiable victim. So in the undetermined condition, the key participant could decide how much they wanted to give to this lose participant before drawing the number of that person. So imagine put your mind in the position of this participant. You have $10, there's this other person, you don't know who they are, they have nothing. How much are you going to give away to them? You don't know who this person is, you're going to draw their number after the fact. It's someone. In the determined condition, the keep decides how much they want to share after first drawing the number of the person that they can share with. So now imagine yourself. You have $10. You draw number 3. How much am I going to give to number 3? Now, this is nothing like the stories that we've been hearing all this morning, where you have lots of information about a victim. This is just a number, and it can be any of the other people in the room. It's completely meaningless, but it's been determined. And sure enough, it matters significantly. So in the determined condition, this is out of $10, so you can think of the max is kind of 5, and a lot of people do give 5. They give on average $3.42 versus $2.12 in the undetermined condition. And so we think of this as identifiability. It's very sort of weakest level without all the typical information that typically confounds identifiable victims in the real world. And so this is, I like to think of this as sort of the purest form of that there is something to the identifiable victim effect just in itself. Layered on top of it is all the natural things that typically occur. So that's the first thing. So identifiable victims have been determined. Oh, I forgot to say. Yes, so in addition to having our participants act in the lab, right? So we have them engage in a behavior, in this case giving. We also ask them lots of questions. And the questions follow the same sorts of patterns that you'd imagine, as I think a lot of people hypothesized earlier in the day with respect to empathy. So people report that people who are paired with a determined person report that they feel more sympathetic, they feel more pity, they want to help. We didn't find, the only item we haven't found differences on consistently, it has to do with perspective taking, which is this item that says, I can imagine myself in their shoes. We talked, I think there was some discussion of this earlier on as well. It doesn't seem to be what's driving the effect, that people are kind of taking the perspective of the person more, but simply they're caring more for that person when that person has been determined. Okay, so the second point I want to make is that identification really matters for one life. And this started with work, not by me, but by some wonderful Israeli colleagues of mine, Tehila Kogut and Alana Ritta. And they ran these studies where they gave people a scenario about a group of Israeli children who were sick and needed a very expensive drug to save them. And depending on what condition participants were in, they either read about 8 children or simply one of those 8 children. And they also experimentally manipulated whether the children were identified. In this case, they did it with a picture or not. So everybody got the same description. Sometimes the description was accompanied by this picture of either 8 or 1. So that's two different things that they varied in the experiment: the number of kids and whether there was a picture or not. And what they found is that they refer to it as the singularity effect, is that the identifiable victim effect mainly occurs when it's one child. So that's these yellow bars here. So people give much more. This is a measure of willingness to contribute. People give much more when one child has been identified, but they don't give any more. The blue bars here is not a significant effect, but they don't give any more to identifying 8 children. And so I think this is really important when we start thinking about identifiable lives. There's just a lot of support that says that it's really about identifying one life, and the singularity matters a great deal. Said I'm mostly going to talk about experiments, but in brief, just because this is one sort of new thing I've done, so I thought I'd throw it in. We did do collect some observational data with Kiva.org, which some of you might be familiar with. It's the leading microfinance intermediary online, where entrepreneurs in third world countries who can't get kind of traditional forms of capital can post proposals working with some field partners online, and people like you and I can go on and lend them interest-free loans. So this is what Kiva looks like if you haven't seen it, and here are some of the different people asking for loans. And one of the nice features of Kiva, from our purpose, is that you can apply for loans either as an individual or as a group. And so we have data on the number of borrowers in each of these proposals. And interestingly enough, there's some microfinance experts who argue that microfinance works better when you have groups of borrowers for a variety of reasons, which kind of goes against the identifiable victim bias. Since all of these loans in our data set are eventually filled, to try to understand which loans are more popular, we look at how long it takes the loans to fill, controlling for things like loan size and other loan characteristics that we have in the data set. And what we find is that, consistent with the singularity effect, as the number of borrowers in a loan increases, loans take longer to fill, suggesting that the most popular loans are the loans are loaning to one individual. As the group size increases, they become increasingly less attractive. Okay. So the final point I want to make is that identifiable victims trigger this strong emotional response. This is what we call the identifiable victims are affect rich, whereas statistical victims are affect poor. They fail to convey emotion. A couple very brief notes about emotion, and then I'm going to turn over the floor to Jen Lerner, who can talk much more about emotion. It's one thing we know about emotion is that emotion motivates action. And in this case, we can think about identifiable victims really kind of tugging at our heartstrings and causing us to open up our wallets and donate. Whereas more cold, deliberative thought tends to overshadow this emotional response. It's important to note that emotions typically are very quick gut reactions. Someone referenced Kahneman's book early this morning. It's part of this more intuitive, fast way of thinking. Deliberation, calculation, much slower, happens a little bit later, and has the tendency of overriding the initial strong emotional response. And so this dichotomy, I think, maps on nicely to the way we think about identifiable and statistical, identifiable victims and statistical victims or statistical information. In one study that we did with the organization Save the Children, we asked participants to donate, and we did this all anonymously, to donate some money that they had received from filling out a survey for a completely unrelated study. And we told them that any money they donated would go towards relieving the severe food crisis in Southern Africa and Ethiopia. So they're all giving to the same cause, and we just manipulated the information in the appeal. We had 3 versions of this appeal, so all for the same cause, Save the Children. This isn't the information we showed them, this is shorthand. But we provided a bunch of statistics that we took directly from Save the Children, so real information that was provided on their website about the needs. So in one condition, they just saw the statistics. In one condition, they saw this little girl, Rokia, and it just said her name. It was her picture, it said her name, and I think that she was 10 years old and from Mali. That was all the information that was provided. We had a third condition in which we presented both her picture and the same statistical information of the first condition. Now keep in mind here, the identifiable victim, according to what I just discussed about emotion and deliberative thought, evokes this urge to this caring and this urge to act and to give, whereas statistics tend to be demotivating. They tend to override this emotional response. And one might think that more information is better, right? Maybe you can appeal to different parts of people. You can appeal to their emotional side, but also give them the sense that their money is going to a good cause. But that's not what we find. We find that the identifiable victim, when there's just a picture, just an identifiable victim, people give more than when presented with statistics. When you present both, it kind of brings them down to the lowest common denominator. And it's sort of a depressing finding, if you will. But I think it just goes to show you that as I said before, I think charities understand the power of an identifiable victim, but they don't necessarily understand all the complete picture. I think they often try to do all of the above and appeal to all types of people and so forth. And that's we don't think that's the best approach. And our evidence suggests that once you get that more deliberative, calculating mindset kicking in people's heads, that has this demotivating effect that overrides this natural emotional response. So, another important lesson of this, and I was thinking during some of the panel discussion earlier today, is it good that we have this empathic response towards identifiable victims? In some sense, yes, even though I think so, and even though it results in this bias, because in the absence of this emotional response, we'd probably see very little caring and altruism at all. Okay. so just to summarize what I've talked about, these 3 points that identify so what is the psychology of the identifiable victim? Well, an identifiable victim has been determined, whereas statistical victims are yet to be determined. And that even in that simple, weakest form, we see this effect on caring. Identification seems to matter mostly for one victim, not a group. And identifiability motivates action by triggering this strong emotional response, whereas statistical information is demotivating. And I put up here some of the sites, and just I'll briefly say my main collaborators on this have been George Lowenstein, Paul Slovic, and more recently with Akiva Data, Jeff Gallick and Andrew Stephen, and also, as I mentioned, Alana Ritov and Tahila Kogut have done a bunch of work in this area as well. And I'm happy to talk more with others offline about, or during the panel discussion, if people want to dig deeper into any of these issues. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Jennifer Lerner, who's a professor of public policy and management at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's also the director of the Harvard Lab for Decision Science, which emphasizes the study of human judgment and decision making. Her research focuses, as you heard, on the role of emotion in decision making, and it's attracted a lot of mainstream media attention of late. And also, she's the winner of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, which I learned is a pretty big deal. So, congratulations.
Thank you. So how's the sound on this? Because I'm using the lavalier. Okay, great. So I like to move around. So that's why the switch in technology. I do have a broken foot. And so we'll see how this goes. But it's a pleasure to be here. It's a special pleasure for me. I'm having this moment of basking in reflected glory because Deborah was my grad student. And, it doesn't get any better as a professor. So I am here to talk about explaining the identified victim bias in terms of psychological mechanisms. And as you heard, my main area of research is the effect of emotion on decision making. My collaborator on this presentation, who unfortunately had to be out of town, is Mark Eddington. And Mark is the executive director of the Harvard Decision Science Laboratory. If any of you haven't heard about the lab, it is a Harvard-wide lab, and we welcome researchers from all across the university to run studies there. I think we have faculty and grad students using the lab from every school now, except for the Divinity School. So I'm happy to talk more about that afterwards. Okay, so here's a slide that is very much like some of the slides we've seen. And this is number of people dying in different parts of Africa. And then we contrast that with this. And I should say there will be a few pictures that are quite disturbing. And I invite you to just look away, and you'll still be fine in understanding the general themes. This one happens to be a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph. And I'm pretty sure it's taking place in Sudan, and you can see the vulture in the background and the starving kid. So I think probably most of you have a much stronger reaction to this than to that table of statistics. And so there are many things that can explain the response. And my lens on this is how exactly emotion explains this difference. Before I go on, I want to tell you what I mean by the term emotion, because it's sort of unfortunate that it's a term that a lot of lay people throw around for everything under the sun, and now academics as well. And so I want to tell you that I have a very specific definition of emotion. And this is developed primarily by theoretical work by Bob Levinson at Berkeley. And the idea is that there are antecedent conditions that can be interpersonal, like you yell at me. And they can be intrapersonal, like I'm a chronically angry person. And some people, you may know some, go throughout the life course with a hostile edge. And then whatever it is, these antecedent conditions are then appraised, and an emotion prototype emerges. So for example, if all of a sudden the glass of water falls on the ground, you appraise it as being caused by a person, in which case you might be mad at their sloppiness, or caused by a situation, in which case you might be worried that in fact, something bad has happened, like there's been an explosion. And then once the prototype of an emotion exists, let's take anger as the example, you automatically get these multimodal response tendencies. So you get a change in feeling, a change in your face, change in your voice, change in your behavior, and also physiologic support for one of the interesting things that happens physiologically when you get mad is that you get more blood flow to the hands, which some evolutionary theorists think is because that way you can aggress. You also get more left hemispheric activation in the brain, which is associated with approach. When people are mad, they approach, they don't withdraw. And a number of interesting things like that. You also get changes in cognition, which lead to what I'll explain more in a minute, we call an appraisal tendency, which is once you're feeling a particular emotion, you tend to then take on the perceptual patterns in future things. It's sort of the emotional carryover effect. Okay, so that's what I mean by emotion. And my overall thesis here is that it's really important to recognize the unobservable factors that influence our judgments and decisions, namely emotion in this case, and then to take our understanding of the mechanisms explaining that in order to design interventions that can reduce bias. And I really like this quote from JFK, not only because I'm faculty at the Kennedy School, but I think he had a real insight ahead of his time where he says, "The essence of ultimate decision remains impenetrable to the observer, indeed to the decider himself." And I put that up front because in over a decade's worth of research on emotional carryover, I've never found that decision makers themselves can recognize these emotional influences. Even when we very specifically grill them on, is there any way that seeing that image as opposed to this image influenced you? No. And and I should say that a lot of the subjects we study in my lab are high-level decision makers. They are typically in the military, colonel or above to four-star general, a lot of government leaders from around the world, members of parliaments, et cetera. And so we're not tricking undergrads or anything like that. These are people who make decisions all the time, but there's something about the brain that we just don't have the ability to introspect on these processes. Okay, so as we've discussed, it's well known that imagery induces specific affective states, emotions per se. We just saw an example of it. And it's interesting that, well, more than interesting, that emotions carry over to unrelated judgments and decisions, even when decision makers themselves don't recognize it, and even when it's not normatively relevant. So here you have the sad artist, and he is painting these images that are traditionally very happy, like a clown a bird at the beach with the sun, a girl and a butterfly. I love the anxiety on the horse's face. And so, I mean, nobody's ever seen a horse with that expression. But this is an example of the carryover. And what's also, I think, interesting about this New Yorker cartoon is that he's not going to be able to sell these paintings, you know? And so it's an example where it would be in your self-interest to not have this kind of carryover. But it seems that this is an area where we humans have very little control. Now, it's not just that a particular emotion can put you in a particular state and then your judgments or decisions are a little different. It actually even controls this carryover phenomenon, even controls behavior. We've done a lot of experiments on how specific emotions influence economic decisions. A lot of experiments where people lose real money in the study. This one is an example of how we do it. Typically, we'll show a neutral video clip in one condition. This is a short 4-minute documentary about coral reefs and National Geographic. And then we randomly assign participants to another. This is going to be a graphic image next, in case you don't want to look. This is a 4-minute clip from the movie Trainspotting. And it's the toilet scene, if any of you have seen the movie. So it's gross and disgusting. And actually, Deb and I have used this video together. It's like it's really great on disgust. And so then we give them a new task. And half are given a square box and half are given an oblong box. And they're told that there's an office supply in there that's worth about $3. And they get to keep the box and the office supply if they want. And this is work with my colleague, economist Richard Zeckhauser, who's one of the discoverers of status quo bias. So basically, the typical finding is if you start out with one box, say the square, and you're offered to trade for the oblong, you want the square. And this status quo bias applies to many, many things. So what we found in this study is that if you're in the neutral emotion condition and you start with the square, you keep the square. That's just fine. If you start with the oblong, you keep the oblong. If, however, you are in the disgust condition, then you trade away whatever you started with. Even though the item has been in the box, and you have no idea what's in it, and it's we tried to make it as generic as possible and as free of confounds as possible. Now, here's the kicker. Not only do you get this reversal of status quo bias, but you also get a whole lot of justification for the choices. So we have people write out, why did you choose the one you did? Why did you keep your box, or why did you trade? And we get elaborate responses. It wasn't like, I don't know. Nobody ever says that. They say, I've always liked oblong shapes. And yeah, I really think of it as more appealing. Or, I've always liked square shapes. I like red stickers. I like green stickers. It looked like this one was bigger. It looked like it had better things. And it's just completely invented on the spot. Nobody says, gosh, either I don't know, or I think maybe somehow the disgust I felt, or, you know. And so we have now this particular study has behavioral consequences because they end up with one box over another. It doesn't actually have financial consequences, but I can assure you the same type of thing happens. We call it the disgust disposal effect. So if you're disgusted for any reason, you want to get rid of stuff and push stuff away. So that's a bit about the phenomenon. So how can this kind of emotion research help us in understanding the identifiability effect and perhaps mitigating it? So one way here is they can help explain the gap between optimal and suboptimal choices. And I take into consideration some of the talks this morning. It's not always suboptimal. And we see from Deborah Small's work and that of others that there are particular kinds of dimensions that are very important. Some of you may know the recent book by Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein on nudges, which is otherwise known as libertarian paternalism, where without telling people what to do, we can set up the constraints of a situation, become a what they call choice architect, so that it's likely that better decisions will be made. What we need, however, is a theory to explain the part that emotion is playing in this, because otherwise we're just kind of randomly trying things out. And there's a fair amount of that in the literature, but it doesn't actually help us to build a cumulative science. And so there is a series of neuroscientific-based theories that are coming out and are very useful for understanding brain connections. For example, understanding when the sensory thalamus actually detects a signal, if it takes the so-called low road directly through the amygdala, which is a non-cortical part of the brain, or whether it does go through the cortex, and different responses you might get from that. And there's many exciting things coming out of it, but there also is a couple of major limitations, which is that it doesn't actually provide a model linking the stimulus to the action. It mostly tells us anatomical kinds of information. And it's also a bit unclear how we could design interventions based on mapping these. So valuable, but also some limits. A complementary approach is what I call the appraisal tendency approach, which is a theory in its infancy that my colleagues and I have been developing. And we have quite a few papers on it that anyone who's interested can get the slides and look these up. These are some of the papers that directly address the theory. Okay. So in this approach, we think that there's this important phenomenon called an appraisal tendency, and I've mentioned this indirectly so far. So it's basically a proclivity to perceive new information in ways that are consistent with the underlying appraisal themes of an emotion. And this appraisal tendency can affect how you think, whether you think in a deep way and a systematic way versus a shallow, quick way. And it also can affect what decision makers think. So I'm going to go over this very quickly as the theoretical framework, but happy to talk more with anyone or give papers. So the strategy that emerges from this framework is that you want to compare emotions that are highly differentiated in the appraisal themes or judgments that relate to that. And so emotion theorists who rarely disagree, I'm kidding, emotion theory is a highly contentious area, but emotion researchers from around the world have agreed that you can take any emotion and characterize it on these 6 dimensions. So typically emotions are characterized as positive, negative, and that's this pleasantness. But you miss a lot of the differences. There's two dimensions that are especially important for risk perception, and that's certainty and control. And Paul Slovic has written quite a bit about that, including his classic paper in Science. So take an emotion like anger. Anger is high in certainty. When people are angry, they feel they know what to do. They don't sit there and doubt and say, well, I don't know, I might. And fear is very low in certainty. The sort of defining appraisal associated with fear is you just don't know what's going to happen. You're very uncertain. And then control, anger, is associated with the belief that individuals are in control. This bad thing happened because you did it. Whereas fear is much more situational. And so we take those differences and I think, yeah, we'll skip to here. We take those differences and we put them together in predictions. So the dominant view, which we call mood congruent or valence, is that if you're fearful, you're going to see more risk because it's a negative emotion. And if you're anger, you're going to see more risk because it's a negative emotion and you're looking negatively. Our theory contradicts those. We say the same thing for fear because it's based on appraisals of uncertainty, lack of individual control. And we say the more angry you are, the less risk you'll perceive. And thank you. So I'm saying all this because much of the work that has been done takes this mood congruent perspective and thinks that if you're in a negative emotional state, you will have a pessimistic outlook. And what I'm arguing here in a self-serving way is that we need a much more nuanced framework, like the appraisal tendency framework, because otherwise we're going to get it wrong. And it's critical to understand the underlying cognitions and biology associated with specific emotions. Here's an example where we did a study. We have perceived risk on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, this is fear in the dotted and anger in the solid. And what you can see is that the more fearful you are, the more you perceive risk in the world. The more angry you are, the less you perceive risk in the world. We have a whole bunch of studies that show these kinds of findings. So I'm just going to tell you an example of applying the appraisal tendency framework to compassion. And Jennifer Getz and colleagues have a beautiful article on that. I gave the full citation in case anyone wants it. And I suggest this as a very promising area of work, given that compassion is the key, or one of the key emotions involved in the identified victim effect. And for future research, I think we could do a lot of research on who is the victim. And as I mentioned earlier, comparing sadness effects. Does the victim deserve my help is another key question. And for example, discuss decreases perception of deserving on the part of the victim, and it triggers this distancing. Another dimension that comes out of Getz's model is, can I help? And so certain emotions are associated with a sense of agency and capability, and other emotions are associated with the opposite. So emotion is a critical factor, and what I am advocating here is an empirically grounded theoretical framework to guide our work going forward. And then once we understand more of the underlying psychology related to emotion, we can develop behavioral nudges. And I want to end with this interesting quote from Adam Smith, who said, "When we are about to act, the eagerness of passion will seldom allow us to consider what we are doing with the candor of an indifferent person. This fatal weakness of mankind is the source of half the disorders of human life." And I have been struck by this exaggeration for many years. But applied to this, it could be truly a fatal weakness of humankind that we need to really take seriously. Thank you.
All right. Our last speaker of the session will be Peter Railton, who's the John Stephenson Perrin Professor of Philosophy at the University of Michigan. He's also a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and his research in ethics and philosophy of science focus on the bearing of empirical research in psychology and the evolutionary theory on moral psychology and the theory of action. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Philosophy is a license to poach. And I'll be doing some of that now. And I'm fortunate to come at the end of this panel because I can skip some of the preliminary work that I had thought I had to do. The first thing I wanted to say, this is on the sort of metaphysical side of philosophy. If we look at the way we interact with others in the world, it's all statistical, whether we try to rescue, try to prevent, whether we confer a benefit or a harm, whether we punish or not. Our effects on each other's are statistical in character, and we have to adapt ourselves to thinking in that way. And the question is, do we have the wherewithal to do it? Are we in some way maladapted, cognitively or emotionally, for a world in which essentially we have this sort of statistical relation to each other and to nature? And I'm just going to restrict myself in this talk to this particular version of the phenomenon of the identifiable victim effect. People's greater willingness to give and give more to a personalized, identified victim than to victims represented as large numerical counts, even when statistical representation reflects greater objective need. What can we make of this disparity, and what might lie behind it? As a philosopher, I can pretty much only contribute speculation to that last question, so I will. One thing that we can say, again, borrowing from somebody else's work, Norbert Schwartz and Dan Gilbert's work on belief, is that specificity and definiteness make belief easier and more confident. If something is more definite, even if the typeface is clearer, the paper is less dirty, you're more likely to believe what you read. Ease is equated with reliability. That's because in the natural world, ease of access to information is related to frequency. This is an effect which isn't at the level of, say, people's reported beliefs or what they say affects their beliefs. This is at a much deeper level of their psychology. And indeed, part of what I'm going to be doing is talking about the sub-basement of the psychology of such judgment. One of the interesting things about the phenomenon, the identifiable victim effect, is it's not really a comparative judgment that people are making of degrees of need. We talk about it that way. But I gather if you run an experiment in which you actually give people a choice between an identifiable victim versus a group of victims and put them on the same page, individuals will moderate this effect quite substantially. And so it's not an obvious cognitive failure, although cognition is clearly involved. It is, however, a question of willingness and behavior. It's what people are willing to do or to intend or to give. And so we have to look beyond cognitive effects and look at the ways in which affective responses, pro-attitudes and con-attitudes enter. And there really are two aspects to this. We've talked mostly about the way in which pro-attitudes toward helping might be strengthened. I'm going to talk also about con-attitudes toward not helping. One thing that we know, and this certainly came up in the talks we heard earlier, is that specificity and determinateness do make empathy easier and thus could intensify helping affect. We have some evidence for this. On the other hand, the effect is not consistently demonstrated, and the effective states that are going to be involved are probably going to be implicit. As Jennifer pointed out, we often don't have access at all to the emotions that were involved in a decision, and so asking people after one of these experiments how sympathetic they felt, we might not be able to reveal exactly what's going on in their psyche. Moreover, as Deborah Small and her colleague Lowenstein found in their beautiful experiments, you can get this effect with virtually no identifying information. You just say a victim versus the victim, and you can induce the effect. So that creates for a philosopher a kind of a puzzle. The empathy story looks very nice. You can see these ideas of an identifiable victim. You sort of identify with that person, but how could you get an effect like this, right, where you just say a victim versus the victim? Now, they, in the 2003 paper, suggest that one possible explanation might lie in the so-called dual process model of the mind, that specific individual targets, the victim, are processed by a different set of systems than general or abstract or merely possible targets. So in the dual process model, this is system one. Specific individuals are processed effectively, automatically via simple heuristics, while general, abstract, or merely possible targets are processed more cognitively, effortfully, and via rational deliberation. And that could certainly yield a discrepancy in what people answer, because two different processes, they don't have to agree. So I'm going to talk about the dual process picture, and I'm going to be talking in particular about a level of study which is one layer below our previous discussion of emotion. So here is a kind of a picture of the dual process view of the brain. This is a path from sensory input to action and decision over here. Input comes in, it goes into the primary cortices where the visual information is decoded for things like lines and curves and shapes. Then the first thing that the information does in interacting with the brain itself is to interact with regions of the brain that specialize in reward and emotion, or affect. And what happens in effect, as the information comes in, it interacts with these areas, and subsequent processing reflects the coding that it gets in these areas. Is it a positive or a negative? Is it something that incites fear or anger? And so to go back to the picture that Jennifer showed of emotion, there was that green plane that the information went through, which was called appraisal. And the appraisal, you can say, is largely taking place here, and it's taking place below the level of higher order cognition. And it's taking place very rapidly. But the question is, what's it like? What's that appraisal like? It can, for example, directly produce action, choice action, for example, implicit behavioral responses, approach or withdrawal, for instance. And so it's capable of steering intelligent behavior. If indeed this information is associated with something that's disgusting, it can produce withdrawal. Something that's attractive, it can produce approach. It can also, in humans at any rate, go up to our language cortex and produce something like deliberation. But it's pretty clear how you could, on this picture, get somebody to choose the oblong box without any idea why. So that when they're up at this level and you're trying to ask them, why did you do it, they're going to elaborate something up here. But it's going to be fabulation. They really won't have access to that information. So, so that's the picture. But I want to say something about this evaluation system that's a little different from what we've been emphasizing so far. The starting point for this is some interesting work that Schultz and others did, trying to understand the nature of reinforcement learning. This is a little bit of a grisly experiment. I'm sorry to say. You've got a macaque strapped into a chair with a little tube going into its mouth through which it can receive sweet juice. You've got it sitting in the chair and nothing much is happening. This is just a tonic firing of neurons. You've got microelectrodes into the striatum, looking at the dopamine neurons that are, if you go back to this picture, we're down in this area down here. And so it's just sitting there in the chair and it's bored. And so you're getting this tonic firing. And then at this point, you give a squirt of sweet juice through the tube, which it likes, and you get this spiking. of these dopamine neurons. Well, you're an experimenter. You want to do an experiment. So you turn on a light 1.5 seconds before the juice. That's the conditioning stimulus. And what you do is you turn it on, and after about 20 times, macaques are very smart, the spike occurs as the conditioning stimulus signal comes in. And then 1.5 seconds later, when it does indeed get the juice, you don't see any change here. Now, why is that? Is it because the macaque has stopped liking the juice? And the answer is no. It got the information it needed from the environment right here. It's learned that. It's not getting new information here. So it doesn't double count the occurrence of the juice. It counts it once. Does that mean it ignores what's happening 1.5 seconds later? No, just withdraw the juice. And here's what happens in the same area. So what you've got is an updating system. It's a system that extracts information from the environment. It targets the information towards the most predictive stimulus, and then it uses that to form forward expectations and to generate error signals when there's a discrepancy. So that's a basic learning system, and those who like this kind of thing will see that this is sort of roughly what Bayesian systems and most automatic learning systems are like. There are feed-forward feedback models. They start off with an expectation, perform some relevant action. They observe an outcome. They detect a discrepancy between expectation and outcome. If there's no discrepancy, no more learning occurs. If there is, there's a revision of expectation in the direction of reducing discrepancy, and then that modifies the expectations going forward and how the action will evolve going forward. And now a system like this, simple as it is, can, with increasing experience, have the effect that the role of your initial expectations diminishes. Inquirers with different starting points, different initial expectations, will tend to converge with increasing information. And you can see why, because it's a discrepancy reduction program. With more information, the expectations will tend to converge toward the actual sample statistics. This is a tuning. If you're an engineer, this is a tuning process. You generate a signal, you compare it with a signal in the environment, and then you reduce the discrepancy. So you're tuning in to features of the environment, such as relative frequencies. And if you're an economist thinking about revealed preferences, this is manna from heaven. Because what it means is we're getting this kind of feedback information constantly. And what is it affecting? It's affecting our affective system, and that's going to affect the preferences that we express, even if we rationalize them in some quite different way. Now, why would we have this nifty little system? And the answer is, look, animals run on batteries. You see a National Geographic special showing cranes flying over the Himalayas to get down to the Indian Ocean. They're all running on batteries. There's no food up there. What are they doing? How do they manage this? And if they ever run out of juice, they're just dead. And so you've had millions and millions of generations of selection for efficiency in extracting information and food and other valuable sources from the environment, other valuable resources. You've got this system working in social animals, in forming alliances or mating choices. You've got the system working in a day-in, day-out way for any foraging animal in its environment. And you know, perhaps, that economists and behavioral ecologists have developed models of optimal foraging, and animals do a pretty good approximation of optimization in foraging. They spend the right amount of time traveling between different sources of food. They respond to the relative risk of the different foods, to the cost of getting that food as opposed to some other food. They solve this complex optimization problem, and they do it by reinforcement learning, essentially by many layers of the mechanism that I just described. And because they're animals, you can put microelectrodes into them, and you can discover that there are neurons in the affect reward system that encode the following information: identity of stimuli, spatial relations, intensity, specific positive and negative rewards, the magnitude, the internal state of the animal, the deprivation state, the relative value of the stimulus, the absolute value, is it a need value or is it a hunger-driven value, for example? Probability or expectation of a positive or negative outcome, occurrence of a better or a worse than expected outcome, the absolute risk of an action, and there are circuits that compute the expected values of actions. You can observe these circuits at work, and if you can read out the expected value of action from them, you get a good prediction of the animal's choice behavior. and this is a body of work that's been evolving over about the last decade, the picture that emerges is the animal faces an environment. It faces not just a physical environment, but an environment of possibilities. It's got expectations, affective and cognitive expectations. And depending upon the expected value of different action choices, it faces a landscape of choice that looks like that. Now, you're probably thinking at this point, he's crazy. You've got this philosopher saying that the animals are making expected utility calculations and they're using this to drive their behavior. So here's a simple T-maze for rats with what are called return rails. So it starts here and runs up. There's some false leads. Then you give it food either on this side or on this side, and you watch as the rat runs through this maze. And what you can watch over time, if you put microelectrodes in the right areas of the hippocampus, is that over time they actually build up a map of this maze. You can keep track of where it is that they fire certain neurons when they're in a different position in the maze. And over time you'll see it as it explores the maze build up this map. So what's this image? This is what a rat does at a choice point. So here's a rat, you've been feeding it more often on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. We're watching now these place neurons, and we're looking at the activation as it approaches this choice point. Now you might expect that what you'd see is like a little pointer. You know, here you are on the map, and that tells the animal where it is. But that's not what you see. The animal's sitting here at the choice point, not doing anything. This is a time scale in milliseconds. And what happens is the activation in this little maze diagram spreads down first the right arm of the maze, then it spreads down the left arm of the maze. It finds less weighting here from reward information from previous trials. The activation spreads down the right arm again. Within a few seconds, it has swept this several times. So the frequency with which it visits a particular arm is a function of the probability and the value of the food it's gotten in the past. And when it reaches a certain threshold, the rat turns right. This takes place within just a few seconds, but the rat is prospecting its way through the maze. You may have seen the studies in which they find that rats dream these mazes at night after they've been run through the lab all day. And the next morning, they're faster performers. They make shortcuts in their sleep in these mazes. And as Lashley, the experimental psychologist, observed back in the 20s, if they escape from the start box, they don't go wandering forward and then turn right. They go to where the food is. And that's because they constructed that representation and they know there's something good waiting for them down there. Okay, well, humans, we can't put microelectrodes in them quite so freely, so we're looking at larger areas. But you can find in humans exactly the same brain structures. They're heavily conserved. Why not? They're wonderfully efficient. And we can find regions that specialize in magnitude, specialize in probability, and that specialize in computing expected value. So here's an example from the ventral striatum. This is a risky choice, probability 0, probability 1. These neurons, as you can see, for a given fixed reward, they fire linearly with respect to probability. That behaves like an expected value. Here we look at another group of neurons. They fire quite differently with regard to probability. They're at a maximum at 0.5. Well, what function are they computing here? That's the risk function. Because risk is maximal at 0.5. As you approach 1 or as you approach 0, risk disappears. So here we've got a factorization between expected value and risk, and animals keep track of both of these, and they're responsive to both of them with regard to their behavior. And if our bankers had paid more attention to their risk function over the last decade and not just looked at the expected value function, they would have figured out what animals figure out, which is something goes wrong when all the batteries run dry. Okay, but don't we all know that humans are terrible at statistical inferences and so on? How could we possibly be built on top of this statistical learning system and be so bad at it? And the answer is, it's not that our emotions are terrible with statistics. It's that our cognition is not great with statistics, because when we do it, we have to simplify. We can only think of a couple of variables at once. It's not a system that's been carefully designed over millions of generations to keep track of conditional probabilities. So take an 8-month-old child and get it to look at, to respond to word sounds in a made-up language, And with only about 3 minutes exposure, it can already begin to detect differences in conditional probabilities among syllables. So a child of 8 months old computes conditional probabilities just fine. But don't ask a 10-year-old, what's the conditional probability of getting the letter E after the letter H in the English language? What would he do? He'd think of the words, few words he knows, and then he would give you some value. But that's not what's going to drive the implicit behavior. Similarly, Josh Green and others have looked at moral judgments, and it turns out that moral judgments can be exquisitely sensitive to the expected value of actions if you know how to ask the right questions. And so again, an implicit capacity that is making intuitive moral judgments, it's not getting your button pushed, it's not an on-off response. It can be responsive to expected value, but then if you ask the person, why did you make this choice in this case but not this case, they may be very hard put to explain it. Dixter House and others have found in choice situations, if you ask people to choose, let's say, a poster to put on the wall of their apartment, that if you can get people to look at the posters and then, during the 5-minute period that they were supposed to spend thinking about which poster to choose, you interrupt them. You run in a little form and you say, quick, you got to sign this, I forgot to give it to you. And they go and they fill in this form, and then you go, 5 minutes are up, you've got to decide. They'll make a more successful choice, a choice that they're happier with 6 months later. And if you get them to sit down for 5 minutes and think, well, which of these posters do I really like the best? And the answer is, when you force people to think about decisions in that way, very often they think of only a few variables, and they can't take into account all the learning that they've had about what kinds of environments they enjoy. Okay, so think of this then as an ecological approach to the question. You've got a system that was built, it's a foraging system, it's a social foraging system. It was built for the task of comparing actual present loss or gain with expected statistical future loss or gain. It's built for those kinds of comparisons. If you look at scrub jays, who are food caching birds, their big problem in the winter is how to get enough nutrients to make it through the night. That means that when they wake up in the morning, they have to worry about storing food. So when they're not hungry, they may, you might think, well, when they're not hungry, they'll store food, but when they're hungry, they'll eat. They wake up and they're hungry, and they've got to start storing food because they've got to have the food available toward the end of the day. And so they will be anticipating future need independent of their motivational state. That's an example of an actual situation, hunger, versus a statistical situation, being hungry, X number of minutes from now. You have to solve these problems to be a successful forager. Early human societies dealt with these problems continuously, whether it was the folks who managed to preserve seed corn through an entire winter so that they didn't eat what was necessary to produce the wonderful cultigens that we've got, whether it's the very elaborate procedures in which they share prey or cooperate over time or deal with the elderly or the ill. We had to continually solve these problems in some way or other. And the whole business of what benefits we confer upon others or what selections we make among others is a crucial part of the process of sexual selection that has driven a lot of our social behavior. So it seems to me it would be very surprising if this core action system built on top of this animal model, the affect reward system, were built in such a way that we can't get people to make reasonable judgments about actual versus statistical cases. The question is, how can you work with the system to do it? It's got the potential for doing it, and the affective system is not there to interfere. Well, shameless speculation. Okay, so let's think in a somewhat ecological way about this very strange phenomenon that simply telling someone that there is the identified recipient or the identified victim versus a victim, that very fact can get them to produce a different response. How could that happen if it's not got anything to do with the information they get about the individual? Well, here's a very important feature of small-scale societies. There's a high degree of mutual dependence. There's a very high degree of knowledge. People tend to know what's going on in the society among them. There's a strong need to behave, constrain behavior informally, You've got to avoid internal conflicts, and you've got to make provision for the future. In that kind of a setting, reputation is extremely important, as is being a good provider, sharing your catch when you succeed so that you will be able to share the catch of others when they succeed. And essentially, people are not in a good situation to evade detection in these situations. So think of it that way, and then think, okay, well, how do you deal with infractions? That would be a bad, someone makes an infraction, somebody's got to punish that person. Well, that's going to create an animosity. So what many of these societies do is they say, no, everybody has to punish the person. Everybody contributes. Or a family member has to punish the person. Why would that be? Because you can't have the persistence of these antagonistic, punitive, violent attitudes toward other members of the group and persist successfully as a group. And indeed, the most frequent norm violation that Bohm found when he looked at 150 of these small-scale societies was bad witchcraft. What's bad witchcraft? It's basically somebody has something bad happen to them, and you've got this person who's got a negative intention, a negative attitude toward him or her, and that person is identified as the source of the problem. So in these societies, it's very important not to form negative attitudes or intentions about the people around you. You're not going to be able to hide them, and you're going to produce potential animosity and exclusion, which is for you a very bad thing. So suppose that's right. Well, then think about a decision to aid the victim versus a question about a victim. And think now that we're not dealing with the statistical part of us, but with the declarative part of us, the language-based part of us. When there's an identified victim, you have to form an intention, if you're going to not to aid this person. You have to form an intention with an identified object not to aid. Well, if there's an unknown person, if the person hasn't been chosen, then there's no one for whom you have formed this kind of a negative intention. If these are societies in which you could expect people to have strong inhibitions against forming this kind of intentional, hostile intention toward a distinctive member of their community, then we'd expect that indeed the difference between just there being someone identified and there not being someone identified, that would change the inhibition that they would feel. They would feel more inhibited about failing to give when they have an identifiable individual than someone who's not yet determined. So I'm remembering the illustration that Deborah showed us of a statistic on hunger, an individual person photo, and then the person with the statistics alongside. When I look at that, and I look at that middle panel, what I see is exactly one person. And I think to myself, can I deny this person aid? And I feel bad about that. If I decide not to do it, I will feel something bad because I have an inhibition against failing to provide. If I see that person then against a swamp of large number of other people, such that my intention doesn't particularly have the targeting effect, or if I see just a large number of other people, I don't get the same effect. And so there it is. If we want to have it, we could get a sort of picture of why even this kind of a difference might exist. But then you might think, this isn't a stupid thing about us. This is an interesting thing about us. We've learned something important, if anything like this is right, namely that humans, because they have to be equipped to live together in families and societies and departments and schools of public health, do have these inhibitions against forming these negative intentions. And rather than seeing that as a form of bias, we can see that as a congealed form of social understanding of group dynamics. And we should also see that we can limit the role that it would play, though, in thinking about policy decisions which affect large populations. So, what can we say? We may be better adapted for thinking and feeling statistically than we give ourselves credit for. We should recognize as best we can what the origins there might be for these effects. I don't think there's probably any one origin. I've suggested a possible origin. You can see how that's a strength of our system as well as a weakness because it equips us to deal well with interpersonal issues. It doesn't particularly equip us to deal well with issues at the global societal level. That tells us something. But this feeling, this inhibition against withdrawing aid or not helping someone, that's something which we should be able to develop and use to form, for example, strong personal relationships, identities across generations and across groups, and forms of social solidarity, and not just me thinking, because it isn't just a matter of thinking from one's own perspective or even of empathy. It's a matter of not wanting to hurt. Okay, so I'm supposed to be an ethicist. Said nothing about ethics. I don't know anything about what I've really spoken mostly about, but here's something where I do feel I have some thoughts. We probably aren't going to be able to develop the kinds of human relationships that are most important for us without this distinctive inhibition against causing these sorts of against refusing resources in this way. And the law is going to recognize that. The law is going to say that intentions with a specific person are treated differently from intentions that are general and abstract. That's a fact about the way we are, and any morality that's going to mobilize our resources has to take that into account somehow. But what way do we take it into account? When we think about plans or policies, as Thomas Schelling was saying this morning, that's not the time to look at that one photo. That's the time for something like contractualist thought. We're thinking that we don't know which role we're going to play. And my God, we've got a theory that helps us do this kind of thinking. And it makes it vivid for us, and it enables us to handle it in a very general way. So we can take advantage of the system that we've got for handling small group relationships, transplant it into the social setting by operating on a contractualist form. There are consequentialist forms of contractualist thought as well. And so in that sense, we can build upon these strengths as well as the weaknesses of the inheritance that we've gotten. Thanks.